The premise of this video is simple. Instead of Natsuki Subaru being the one who's transported to ReZero, Lelouch gets transported. We will be assuming this is before Zero existed, meaning that Lelouch at this point in time is only just preparing to eventually wage a war against Britannia, and with the presumption that he has not met yet C2, or created a contract that gave him the Geass. Lelouch will in place of the Geass get Return by Death, which is fair, considering that giving him both the Geass and Return by Death will make for an unfair combination of powers in this hypothetical. We will also be presuming that Lelouch's mental fortitude for some reason is the same as Subaru's, since otherwise he'll just turn into a vegetable after his first Return by Death, which wouldn't make for a fun video. Now that we have the premises in place, let's get into the scenario. But before that, sub up and join the Discord server, as I'm active on there more often. There will be spoilers for Season 1 to Season 4 Episode 11 of ReZero, as well as spoilers for Code Geass' main 2 seasons, but beyond that, there will be no spoilers for ReZero from the future arcs. You may think that Lelouch could probably deal with Arc 1 without major difficulty, but that of course doesn't withstand when you think about it, considering I would say that Lelouch is far worse off than Subaru ever was in the beginning. Let's first talk about Lelouch is completely useless when it comes to fighting barehanded without any weapons. His physical abilities being useless enough that he gets tired even during extremely short sprints, as we see in R1. And in a series where the main character has to do a lot of evading in conflict, this is a big problem for that. He has basically zero training in any weaponry either besides nightmares, which of course is completely irrelevant in this world. Lelouch's mindset as a whole would be also far different from Subaru, and a lot more depressing when you look at his character. Overthrowing Britannia after he was betrayed by his own family for being weak was a purpose he'd chosen to create a better world for his little sister. A purpose he'd been building towards for basically his entire life, to the point he was willing to die for the people he would kill in the future. But in this world, that's completely gone. There is no Britannia, there is no Nunnally, there is no purpose to him living. So in a sharp contrast to Subaru, who was super happy when he got isekai'd into this world, viewing it as the restart of his life, for Lelouch, it would mean that the years he'd been spent were all completely a waste of time, and that he would only be able to solve the problems that still existed. We're also well aware how a Lelouch looks like in R2, and this Lelouch will most likely be far more depressed than that one if you recall. That was enough to push Lelouch to using drugs as a coping mechanism and going as far as to ask Kallen to confront him as a woman. So we can only imagine what kind of mental state he'll be in this world. If you were expecting Lelouch to be kicking and well, or somehow trying to take control of Lugunica, anything along those lines, you'll be very much wrong. He most likely zone out for a bit after he realizes that he's gotten isekai'd, and just freeze up before he just wanders around the royal capital. Eventually, we know that he would come across the 3 thugs in Arc 1, which won't end up well for him, considering he has no Geass, no physical ability, as well as no will to fight them at all. Most likely just getting beaten up until he's highly injured or potentially even killed after he gets robbed. Some of you might say that Lelouch would likely then crave his own path, entirely different from the one Subaru deals with in canon, that will basically create a branch in the story different from the main timeline. But that won't be the case. Roswaal's Book of Wisdom will specifically change the events Roswaal needs to take for his goals in the future, meaning that it will now be updated for details regarding how Lelouch would do things, as well as the steps Roswaal needs to take specifically to ensure Lelouch would join the Emilia camp as his strongest trump card, because of Return by Death. Lelouch's intelligence itself will be an extra asset that will help, but not the most major thing. Lelouch will likely eventually be forced to accept his reality, as no matter how much he hangs around dead, he'll eventually need to do something. The only way I can see Roswaal's plan going is that he'll most likely ensure a way that Lelouch learns about the royal selection, and then the half-elf racism, whether that be through hearsay or a direct look at it from some sort of discrimination he gets to witness towards Emilia. Learning about the royal selection might remind him of his original goal of constructing and reconstructing the world anew, and using this goal to replace his previous one. Lelouch will likely try to research things behind the scenes on how exactly he could, or if there's even a way for him to be able to return to his original world at all, even though it would fail to no avail in the background of things. While he certainly wouldn't fall in love with Emilia like Subaru, he'd get a different motivation of reconstructing the kingdom through Emilia, and reconstructing it in his own eyes. It's possible Elsa is not involved in this arc at all, since there'd likely be no benefit to having her try to kill Emilia, but he'd most likely still eventually run into Reinhard, where they share a small conversation. Lelouch will likely just serve as a guest in the mansion, at least for now, before he could do anything until Arc 3, he'd likely have a far different relationship with Ram as well, most likely a more respectful one at least, where everyone in the mansion has a less intimate relationship than the one Subaru formed with the camp. Rem will be very suspicious of him because of his scent, and there will likely be no Rem moment per se. The first loop would end not with Lelouch's death, considering he never even got the chance at all to get the curse in the first place, so he'd be safe, but Rem would still die, considering she'd still have to go through the island village, and Lelouch would get two options. Either they mourn the death and move on, or Lelouch tries to save Rem. In my opinion, it'll most likely be the former. While Lelouch does not really want unnecessary deaths, especially that affect his own, I can't see him going out of his way to risk his own life being permanently gone, because he doesn't know whether return by death is infinite or not. The existence of checkpoints or anything like that is all just in a black space that he's not aware of currently. I can't see how a Lelouch that doesn't have affection for someone like Rem would even do something like that, considering how much a return by death would risk everything on the line. As sad as it is, most likely Rem would just die and the story will move on from there. Ram might try to blame Lelouch, but I highly doubt it, considering that Lelouch most likely did not react the same way Subaru did, which was a reason why Ram began to chase him in the first place. So most likely it would end up with mourning her death and eventually just moving on from that. During the time skip of Arc 2 and Arc 3, Lelouch would most likely spend a lot of time learning about this world, whether that be its history, culture, as well as many more things alongside many other things. He perhaps tried to study how exactly wars are fought in this world, and many other things that are completely new to him in this world. Also, unlike the Geass, I really don't think Lelouch would be able to test return by death's limits at all, considering I don't believe he'd even use it to save Rem. There's no reason at all to assume, at least initially, that return by death provides you with infinite retries. The only amount you can be sure is a limit of the amount of times you return by death previously, and any more than that could lead to your death. So I believe Lelouch isn't gonna be interested in just randomly doing that. Not to mention, I highly doubt Lelouch would kill himself again and again, even if I'd given him Subaru's mental fortitude in this scenario. Lelouch would perhaps learn some more magic, but he'd most likely be fairly useless in direct combat, considering how abysmal his physical capabilities are that will make casting magic in the front place only a dream against a real enemy. Lelouch has no background or any achievements at this point so far, so the Emilia camp would likely not declare or have Lelouch declare himself as Emilia's knight. Or rather, even any particular argument happening at all is unlikely, considering Lelouch would most likely know his place and not go in the ceremony to interrupt it by most reasons. Although, that would also leave Emilia unshielded from the racism that she would face during this. But that would not really be ideal as per what Roswaal wants, which is to provide Lelouch with a path to clear an extremely difficult obstacle to prove his ability, being important for Roswaal's future plans as a whole. Roswaal specifically engineered it so that Subaru would head out to the rose ceremony even after he was told not to by Emilia, so that he could later crash out, meaning that he'll be in basically negative social standing and have to build himself all the way to being seen as powerful as a trump card as he seems to be on paper. Lelouch would have likely either had his presence orchestrated by Roswaal's plans or have him be in the rose ceremony to begin with. One possible situation I could see, or rather an interesting one in particular, could be Priscilla and Lelouch's interaction, which I believe could act as basically the only way to trigger Lelouch into doing something that could somewhat be close to Arc 3 Subaru's crash out. Priscilla is a very smart person, smart enough to easily be in talks of being the smartest character in the entire series, with there being only few who surpass her intelligence. And on top of this, she's really good at reading people despite their attempts at hiding how they feel through masks, something we see with Subaru as even before his crash out, she had predicted something like that would happen in the ceremony, being one of the only characters who can straight up perceive the differences in one's soul just through her insight alone. Lelouch would then have his inner conflict, which in context is obviously most likely going to be his guilt regarding his previous world and most importantly his little sister. We've seen how emotional Lelouch gets over his sister, to the point it takes all his power to not have a breakdown in front of her all the way later in the final arc of the series, where even then barely being able to do so. A Lelouch that has been constantly dying, having to deal with the trauma of death and suffering, having guilt of how he left Nunnally completely behind without anyone else to look after her. It will surely eat away at him even at this point, which will make him far more emotionally vulnerable than he ever was in R1 or R2. So I totally believe that it's very much possible and not that hard to rage bait Lelouch in a situation like this, considering how we have seen him act when it comes to his little sister. The outcome of that situation would most likely force him to stay in the road capital to calm his mind down for a bit before he can come back to the mansion, most likely providing him with money as well as information that will be important later on for Roswaal's scheme. Lelouch would likely eventually return to the mansion all alone, where he'd be forced to die soon enough, after he gathered the courage to return from the road capital where he'd witnessed the Arlen massacre and then witnessing the deaths of everyone else in the mansion before most likely dying a similar death to Subaru's first death in Arc 3. Lelouch would have a horrible time during Arc 3, considering he's completely all alone without anyone to help him mentally at all, before he has to gather his courage and go towards the mansion to save the inhabitants of Roswaal's Manor from death. Subaru was only mentally not permanently insane in this arc because he had REM. Without even a single person to accompany him, it's very much possible that Lelouch would just legitimately be cooked, and considering that Lelouch's mental state might unironically be worse than Subaru's before the spiral of death begins, it's very much likely that he just genuinely just does not get past this arc at all. If someone was here to confront Lelouch, it might have been possible, but it's highly unlikely to think of anyone who could even if they were here, considering how a person like Rem was so specifically needed for our protagonist to fall into despair. Lelouch's intelligence is seen numerous times to just not be there when he's mentally unstable, as we see once during R2 episode 7, as well as the episode where Rollo died, where he's just legitimately inconsiderate of the fact he's going to be killed, and until he realizes that Rollo is sacrificing himself for him, that mental state did not change whatsoever. If we were to presume that Lelouch somehow just happened to get unwavering mental fortitude, then sure, he'd most likely find a way to clear the arc in 2 to 4 loops, where his biggest problem would be proving himself to Kush without the existence of a phone that Subaru originally used to act as evidence to her, as well as then most likely playing a more active role in the battle against the White Whale, and then finding out the winning conditions against Betelgeuse, being able to witness the unseen hands after dying a few times, and then in the end, finding a way to counteract the fingers that Betelgeuse has, eventually even needing a way to prevent his own body from being taken over. But in my opinion, it's just far more likely that Lelouch just doesn't make it out of this arc at all, considering his mental condition. The Sanctuary is an interesting arc to discuss this. We'll presume that the very unlikely situation I mentioned happens, and Lelouch just somehow finds a way to solve everything, proves himself worthy of Emilia's knight and everything, and we progress towards Arc 4 like that. Lelouch would most likely be extremely suspicious of Roswaal at this point, similar to Subaru, and likely wouldn't trust anything given he'd fall into similar suspicion that a lot of what he was doing had Roswaal's hand in it. Arc 4 would actually most likely be not that difficult of an arc when it comes to finding a way to beat it, compared to Arc 3 at least. The nature of Roswaal's test regarding fully ensuring that Lelouch's will is only towards saving Emilia, and that he cannot save everyone will likely be the same, with the people who've been dying likely being both Beatrice and Frederica. Petra wouldn't have any reason to join since unlikely Lelouch would have any interaction with Arlen Village in that way. Lelouch already held a will that was prioritizing his current goal to ensure Emilia becomes a queen, so he'd most likely just accept that the deaths are just a part of something he can't stop, even if it would be preferable for them to save both sides. The most problematic situation in here would be that Lelouch would likely just not be able to pass even the first trial at all, since it's one that is related to his past, which will likely only yield him more suffering than even the amount Emilia suffers in Arc 4, so he'd most likely once again be in a not so good mental condition at all. Lelouch's only way therefore will likely be just to help Emilia through the trials again and again, until he finally manages for her to be able to pass the trials. I do think he would also genuinely try to help Garfield with his trauma, considering Lelouch also shared a complicated relationship with his own mother, to realize that Garfield's pride as a shield of the Sanctuary was just a defense mechanism, rather than just trying to break Garfield apart mentally to force him to accept that the trials would be beaten. Roswaal and Lelouch wouldn't be at odds like how Subaru and Roswaal were, although Lelouch would of course heavily rethink his opinion of Roswaal and the future regarding his relationship with him, but there's nothing of sort like the straight bet between them. Echidna and Lelouch would have had some fun conversations if they got much opportunity to do so in the first place, which I believe is not that likely. Although Lelouch might still ask things in their first meeting, he'd still be suspectful regarding their validity as well. Not to mention, Lelouch wouldn't get the explicit information Subaru did, that his respawns are infinite, and that he doesn't need to worry about them running out, which would also limit his approach for a bit longer. Although I can see at some point, Lelouch just accepts that he might have infinite retries and use that approach. Lelouch doesn't really have a fun time in Britannia. The first serious loop would most likely go the exact same way. I don't think there will be any major differences at all. He'll most likely decide to immediately call over Reinhard, since unlike Subaru, I don't believe he'd even have the ghost of a thought to actually try relying on just his own physical capability alone, and would, similar to Subaru, just try to use the trump card of the kingdom and just kill her. This of course would fail, and he'd die once again, realizing that Sirius's authority can be used to kill the people around her as well if she dies. The third loop would most likely just be a copy of Subaru's fourth loop in Britannia, where Lelouch just has an awful time after Regulus takes Emilia away. Lelouch leads the battle to City Hall, which goes far worse than it does in the original timeline, since Lelouch doesn't have the multiple curse situation going on in his blood. He's actually vulnerable to the dragon's blood, meaning that he gets the exact same situation as Kush, where he's just completely bedridden and has to somehow find a way to restart the loop, presuming the checkpoint has not moved at all, so that he can redo things from the start. From then, the arc should progress roughly the same as the original one, as long as it just avoids Capera. So sadly, Cruz is just going to have to suffer all on her own without anyone to take her pain away, since if he did want to help her to his knowledge at least, there was no way to do that. Lelouch is also the best pick for the person who'd be most suitable for giving the speech in Britannia, so I don't see any problems there at all. The rest of the preparation before the final battles in Britannia begin will most likely progress the same way, without many changes until the Regulus fight. Lelouch would most likely accompany Reinhard to save Emilia once again, but it'll really not go well with them. Lelouch would certainly try to test multiple hypotheses he could think of regarding how exactly Regulus's authority works, but none of them could be actually pinpoint the crux of his authority, which is needed to be able to kill him. And of course, that is most primarily because of astronomy. We don't have an indication that Lelouch is familiar with stars, or at least not the same depth Subaru was, considering he had an obsession with it since he was a kid, and there is no content in Code Geass that points towards the same for Lelouch to suggest he know enough that he could deduce Regulus's connection to the stars. Lelouch would most likely return by death multiple times, trying to grasp at something, but without the knowledge Subaru has, I don't see what exactly can be done against Regulus, besides just retreating with Emilia and stalling with Reinhard. I don't think just saying Lelouch could guess the connection or authority holds much meaning either, considering we know that even Reinhard with his absurd intuition could not do that. The stress from a turn by death would also start piling up, as he'd also get worse with the amount of loops he'd spend trying to find a way out. The arc would just most likely end with the witch cult suffering no major losses, at least compared to ours, with their only main losses being the dead corpse of Tedescia and Kurgan, with our side losing far more, even with Aldebaran and Lelouch doing things. We won't cover much of this arc since we really can't cover much at all, but we can at least cover up to the first trial of the anime. They'd most likely be able to get to the Pleiades watchtower relatively safe, at least without anyone dying in the final loop, after Lelouch dies a few times to Shala and the Witch Beast. He'd also likely have much more of an incentive to use the relationship Shala thinks they have between each other compared to Subaru. But just like the previous arc, the problem becomes that Lelouch most likely lacks the knowledge of astronomy to the same extent Subaru did, meaning that he likely failed at solving the first trial, which would just put them in a standstill on having them basically no way to do anything, and also having no way to leave the tower without angering Shouda. If he did have the knowledge, then he'd most certainly be able to find about the connections and successfully solve the puzzle, just like Subaru did. But like I previously said, I don't believe there's any reason to assume Lelouch has astronomy knowledge besides pure conjecture without basis. Lelouch and Code just kind of get stuck in a deadlock where they're unable to solve the trials, and would most likely have to just somehow find a way to leave, that too alive, and the rest of the many problems of Arc 6 will just kind of disappear, since they don't get to face them. Overall, while it is a fun scenario to imagine, it is a bit sad that neither Lelouch nor the Emilia camp are really fully happy in this situation. Lelouch most likely is never gonna be able to get over the fact that he can't go back, and given that he isn't Subaru, who had an interest in saving other people and their hearts, to save them out of the goodness of his own heart and not personal interest, there will also be a gap between them and their canon versions. The fact that Subaru isn't the one who's going through a lot of the events makes the timeline also vastly different, to the point how exactly it develops is hard to say. To begin with, we need a very confident way to ensure Lelouch does not just mentally break to even think of the scenario in the first place at all. The scenario itself features a very depressed Lelouch throughout, because he just kind of lost the original will that kept him going, and he isn't a person like Subaru to act the way he did during Arc 2, and even between the time skip to find relationship Subaru did. It could have been more extravagant if we assume that Lelouch's character was stretched around to do some unlikely things to make it possible for him to progress. Subaru's the protagonist for a reason, and no matter who it is, if we try to replace someone different than Subaru that lacks certain qualities in them, that would most certainly result in a quote-unquote worse timeline for them. If we certain to be more accurate, then it's actually pretty likely that Lelouch will not even get returned by death, and most likely just get an authority that is more suited to his own personality. So basically, he just get a Geass in ReZero. But the problem is that afterwards is that he just dies fairly quickly into the story, because ReZero cannot just be cleared for Subaru's position without collecting deaths at all. Even more so when you're not a superhuman. There's just a lot of moving parts that are extremely hard to predict, such as Rem, Emilia, all the personal relationships Lelouch would inevitably formulate in his stay in the mansion and the later arcs, the time skip, etc. For anyone who thinks Rem might try to kill Subaru, I doubt that, considering the specific conditions in the loop of Arc 2 that led to Rem trying to kill Subaru would surely not arise in this what-if scenario. While Rem might hate Lelouch because of his scent, I don't believe she'll still go out of her way to kill him. Not to mention she doesn't have enough time to do that anyway. The idea of Lelouch being in ReZero would undeniably be most fun to explore in Arc 7 and Arc 8, but sadly, given that most of my audience is anime only, it'd be a tough time having to cover those arcs as the main focus of my video. But if you are all interested in a video where I do cover Arc 7 and Arc 8 under Lelouch's hands, feel free to comment about it, and I might just end up making a video about it where I continue this scenario. Lelouch and Vincent would really be best friends and the best partner for each other. Additionally, if you have any alternative ideas about how this scenario will go otherwise, then feel free to detail it in the comments down below if you think I got something wrong.